And here's a little list of tools that you'll need for the replacement of a starter on a 2003 and that generation of Honda Odyssey V6 engine. You're going to need the big 25-inch breaker bar, just because everything's so far down there. And the 2 17mm fasteners that hold the starter in are very tight. Not real hard to get to, but they're very tight. So you're going to want that. And once you break them loose, you're going to want a 1/2-inch drive ratchet and a big ass cheater bar. Again, like I said, they're very tight and it's hard to get to. Everything's pretty deep down in the engine compartment, and try to get a hold of this without this is really difficult with the amount of stress that you need to put on the fasteners to get those 17mm off. You're going to want the extension to put onto the bottom 17mm bolt that's long enough to get past the housing on the starter. You're going to need a 14mm and 14mm, I'm sorry. You're going to need an 8mm, a 10mm, a 17mm socket, obviously, because I said that a couple times already. And then you're going to need, I've probably not put it down there. You're going to need a 13mm socket to get the battery cable off of this starter. Again, like I said, you don't want to try to take the 17mm bolt off the starter on a smaller drive ratchet, because you will break the extension, because I did immediately. Just go ahead and start off with your 1/2-inch drive. You'll be better suited. And that's all the tools you're going to need for this job. And now we have our list of tools. We'll start off by taking the battery stay bracket off. You want to loosen up the 10mm bolt in the front and the rear. Notice it does say front to point which way this goes when you're putting it back on. You want the big part of the bracket in the front of the battery. Take your two 10mm fasteners off, loosen the nuts off of the negative battery terminal, positive battery terminal, pull up, take the battery out of the car, and pull this bracket off. We're going to pull these two relay boxes off of the bracket that's attached to the battery. We're going to take the 10mm bolt off the bracket and move everything out of our way. For that, we're going to pull these heater hose separator clips off. And just take those off. That's going to afford you some more room. Whatever you do, though, don't take out the battery tray. There is absolutely no need to do that. It is hard. This is the Odyssey with the no-go starter. I'm going to start off by unhooking the battery cable. Just going to take off the negative terminal. That way I don't fry myself when I start pulling around on the wiring harnesses that go on. This terminal's off. And obviously I'm going to take out a few fasteners to get it loose. First one I take off is here. It's a battery terminal. Edges less than stellar on the focal point. Don't pull that one off. There's going to be a few more. There's one on the bottom side back here for the starter. It's coming out of the ignition switch. One up here on the top, and one further down here on the bottom, that neither one of which you can see from this angle, but I'm going to pull those out. Start out with a 12mm ratchet wrench and start yanking this stuff apart. Alright, so on this Odyssey, you can see I took out the battery. The battery case that goes underneath the battery. Moved all these wires out of the harness for the relays and the battery connectors underneath the battery tray itself to kind of get them out of the way. The bolts aren't really that hard to get to on the top anyway. That's pretty easy, and it's a nice short bolt. It's loosened up already, broke it. Show you the implements of destruction I used to kind of break them loose. There's also this one down here underneath it, and it's a pain in the ass to get to. You gotta have your wrenches and everything kind of at a goofy spot, and it's pretty tight. I don't know what the torque is coming out is, but it's pretty tight. Plus you got the carbonic corrosion between the aluminum and steel parts. I already took off the power cable to the battery itself and pull this coupler off and finish taking these last two bolts out, but I just want to kind of show you what I did, because I've seen people do really difficult things like taking this out to give them a little bit more room. unhooking radiator hoses to get more room, and I may have thought of something else, but I want to play with that after I get the starter out of the car. So here's the old starter out of the van now. This bolt down here was pretty hard to get out just because of the location. There's not a whole lot of room to move inside underneath this starter. I thought about taking this housing off of the starter itself, and which would give me a little bit easier access to this fastener right down here. It's 17 millimeter, it's in there pretty tight, and I had to use a 25-inch breaker bar to bust the bolt loose. So I'm going to take this apart, come back in a second. I already took one of the bolts out. It's only an 8 millimeter. There's two of them. This one, there's a bracket that goes back onto it. I've been putting, the bracket's going to be going on the new starter here in a few minutes, and then I'll put it back together. But this might save some time and effort taking the starter out in the first place, because I've seen people do crazy stuff like take the battery base and hook heater hoses, all their cooling line hoses and stuff like that, and I just think that's kind of an unnecessary step, and that battery bracket's not going to be easy to get out, I imagine. Alright, so now I got the other bolt out. The only thing that's holding this on now is just that nut on the other side that holds a wire onto the starter. So once we pull this out, you got pretty solid assembly. It's all sitting in here with the bearings and the windings and whatnot. And over here on this end, none of this is going to fall out. I was worried about something might come out into the engine, but that's pretty solid. So I think that if you do decide to do this, if you just take this off with two 8 millimeter bolts, pull this little nut off right here if you need to get all of it out of the way, you'll be a lot better served, because then you got a pretty clear shot at getting that. But anyway, it's a little cheater. I thought about doing in the beginning, but I was just kind of concerned that, well, usually when I'm turning a wrench, goofy things can happen, and they will happen. But I think this will be the best option instead of fighting around everything like I did and I've seen everybody else do. So anyway, that's something to give thought to. See ya. This bracket is attached to the starter. I had a little bit of a hard time getting this clip off, so I just took it off of the starter while it was still in the car. But you can see now that everything is out of the starter is out. The two fasteners for the starter are out. I just unhooked the bracket from the battery base, tucked it all up in here, give me a little bit of room. I took this off of the clamp that's also attached to the bracket that goes onto the starter. And there's the two big bolts that hold that sucker in there. Plus some various implements of destruction that I just had out that I really didn't need. You don't need this. You don't need that. Basically all you really need is this and the shorter one to get to this top bolt. But we'll see that. It did come out. The battery base is still intact, never came out. Heater hoses are still in, just took the separator clamp off of the heater hoses. And then we'll be putting it back together. Alright, so the starter's in. Tighten down the top two bolts. The top bolt. This bottom bolt. Took this little 8 millimeter fastener out. Put the bracket on for the antifreeze line, cooling line, and the harness that clips to the bottom of it. It's all back in there. It's all secure. I'm going to just finish buttoning the rest of this up and we'll be ready to go. So everything's completely in now. You got the two 17 millimeter bolts, the bracket for the harness, and this radiator line. I'll put this 13 millimeter fastener back on, set the coupler back in. Don't over tighten that, it's just a little copper post and it's on a plastic mounting surface, so if you over tighten it, I guarantee you it will break off. Alright, so everything's back together. Put the 10 millimeter bolt back in the bracket for the relays onto the battery base. Battery's back in, everything's tightened back up on the positive and negative battery terminals, the battery bracket, and then everything else down here is still the same. I got the heater hose separator clips back in, and two 17 millimeter bolts on the starter, and 13 millimeter bolt on the starter wire from the battery. There's a little 1P black coupler that goes on top of the starter. And it, like I said, it's all back together. Don't fall for the trick of pulling the battery base out though whatsoever, because that is a really hard thing to do. I've done it before on many cars, and it's not something you ever want to do.